buying a commercial property, selling a commercial property, these two things are transactional. But when it comes to actually holding a commercial property, it is all about the relationship and the tactics you apply to getting the best outcome for your asset. And this is where effective asset management is key in the world of commercial property. So today we've got a returning guest, Allison from MMJ Real Estate, who specializes in deploying key strategies, setting up leases for success, and also using strategies to avoid long vacancies, things that hurt commercial property owners a lot. And so we're going to deep dive into all of these strategies and more, and how you can avoid the mistakes with Allison's decades of experience when it comes to commercial property management. So let's jump in and speak to Allison from MMJ Real Estate. Allison, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Really excited to be back.
Well, we've got, Allison, you're from obviously MMJ Real Estate, and there are some new listeners in for this episode. So maybe for those that haven't tuned into your previous episode, which by the way, anyone tuning in, do check it out. We went deep into the Melbourne market where value can be added and more into some of the biggest and coolest deals that we've unpacked. But in this episode, I want people to know just a bit more about MMJ Real Estate. Where do you operate? What do you do before we jump into it all?
Yeah, sure. Well, MMJ Real Estate has been around almost 70 years and it started off in Wollongong, family-run business, Martin, Morris and Jones, and we're still lucky enough to have Tim Jones, managing director of the Wollongong office there, so it's third generation. And they wanted to obviously expand nationally and set about creating a Perth, Canberra, Sydney, Melbourne and Illawarra location. So we operate virtually nationally. Our Melbourne office is lucky enough to be licensed in Brisbane as well, so I look after things in Brisbane. And we are a full-service commercial real estate agency. In fact, our Wollongong even offers residential and town planning as well, and business sales. So we have a little bit of everything to offer, I guess. From a Melbourne standpoint, we're sales, leasing, asset management and consultancy. And so we, help people every day with various transactions.
Well, what an awesome success story from an Australian business kicking off in Wollongong. My memories of Wollongong, great beach, good food, and surprisingly, a very, very good pubs, and bars. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Obviously, it's been some years since I've had a sip of anything, right? But it was a really, really good spot for that. Now, today I wanted to unpack with Chris more about the world of commercial asset management. People seem to think that just because it's a great business, just because, the numbers look great, everything surely must be a walk in the park, and why get someone? Why not just do it myself? And we know that's not the right way to do it, but you know it more than anyone. And so I'm keen to unpack some of the DIY horror stories that you've seen in commercial property management, because obviously we all know what happens. They call you to come and clean up the mess, which is the less appreciated, but the most rewarding part when you get right. So keen to hear your thoughts on some of the DIY stories you've seen.
Oh, sure. One that comes to mind, I actually was approached by a lovely gentleman who had been self-managing his strata office out in Clayton in Melbourne. The tenant had exercised their option, I'm saying that with inverted quotes, and then actually changed their mind and vacated the property. And as a self-managed owner, he didn't really quite know how to deal with that, and he kind of let them get away with it. And then he called me when they didn't really leave the property very well. So I kind of came on board and not only negotiated a settlement for the fact that they had in fact exercised their option and should really be paying him some more rent, but also negotiated a make good settlement figure for them to pay out so that we could do all of those works that they hadn't done, cleaning, replacing the lights. Some of the carpet was, stained, needed steam cleaning, fixing, things like that. And I think this gentleman just didn't have, obviously, the knowledge of the lease in order to be able to dictate to them exactly what they should have been doing, but also just a lack of confidence to be able to have those conversations as well. And he was kind of being walked all over. So, he was able to get me involved and, pay us a fee to look after that for him. And he was so thankful, you know, just the fact that he didn't have to worry about it anymore. And he'd been managing the financials of the property like with paper. So, you know, the fact that I went through and I went, oh, well, you haven't really charged this outgoings and you haven't charged this. We need to include that in our settlement. So he was really happy at the end of the day.
How much do you think it would have saved him if he just had you from the get-go?
Oh,
that's a good question.
Dollars, proper dollars.
Yeah, proper dollars, because they'd been there for probably 10 years.
Right.
Yeah.
And I came in and swooped in with the data that I had available at that time, which was, I don't know, maybe 6 months worth of paper that he was able to give me. But I dare say that he probably hadn't recovered the outgoings appropriately for the entire lease.
Wow.
I'm talking probably to the tune of, I would say, maybe $30,000 or $40,000.
When you invest in commercial property, the reason why typically we want to invest in commercial property is because it's not for the 6% net yield that we're going to get today. It's for the 1 to 2 to 3 decades of cash flow that we're going to get from that property. And you know, if you're having kinks in those years where you have big capex that could have been managed in the first place by a property manager, you're actually, you know, your commercial property is going to be far more profitable in the long run than it is if you didn't have one.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. I mean, something that we do as property managers in the commercial realm, certainly from our agency's standpoint, is we take a strategic view of capital expenditure. If we're seeing that we're getting a call out for air conditioning too often, that's when we say to the landlord, like, let's consider replacing replacing the motor instead. And that way you're not going to continually have these issues. We're going to reduce the outgoings for the property, which does have a very strong impact on tenant retention. If the outgoings are too high, tenants don't want to stay, or it's not a valuable proposition if anybody's coming into the space either. It makes it less attractive in the leasing market if the outgoings are too high for a comparable property.
On that DIY part, with all of these things that you're mentioning, knowledge is clearly a big gap.
Yeah.
Like, we're learning together every time we're chatting with you. And then we're years in the game, 7 years in this industry, you know, longer than that in terms of, you know, the different scales of deals Chris has worked on as well. And if we're still learning, it's only like, how much is that person learning who's new?
Yeah.
But then I totally get you on the walkover part, because I think it's also unintentional where they see the residential leasing world. And it's so common in the residential leasing world where, you know, there are a lot more things in favor of tenant.
Yeah.
And as a result, landlords or property owners kind of tread lightly. They don't want to go into the new spot, or they don't want to go into a space where they have to fight a battle that they really shouldn't fight, or they can, let's just find the easier way out.
Yep.
We're in business. It's a lot more T's and C's and dollars and cents.
Yep.
And I think that's a part that, you know, you are able to come and give recognition to that they just didn't consider.
Yep.
That's an interesting point, Arjun, because when I speak to investors, majority of investors that are investing in residential real estate, they have a property manager appointed to that property. But in commercial, I'm finding it more common that people are doing it themselves.
Yeah.
Do you know why that is?
Obviously trying to save money, but it is more important from a commercial standpoint. The risk for a commercial landlord is so great. I can't fathom why anybody would allow themselves to take on that risk themselves. Things like essential safety measures. Part of what we do is make sure that the tenants are maintaining their premises in accordance with essential safety measures, or that we are doing it on their behalf. Say there was, you know, a fire or something like that, and there hasn't been an annual essential safety measure sign-off, and God forbid somebody is tragically hurt or passes away, the landlord can be held personally liable for that. So I couldn't imagine putting that on myself. I mean, I have residential property investments. I don't even manage them myself because that's not my forte. I'm a commercial property manager, and I recognize the power and the benefit that comes with having a residential property manager to look after my properties.
Yeah, and I think what you just made me think of then is like this comparison between the way people approach insurance as well in a similar way.
Yep.
Where they go, I'm just going to take away this expenditure, because what if I save $1,500, I don't have insurance per annum, very like random figure, times 10 years, 15,000. Like you have some event happen in 10 years on a house, right?
Yep.
And that's likely to be bigger than 15,000 if it's a decent event. And same with personal insurances, same with that. And I almost feel like anyone looking at that commercial side with that fashion or that thought, especially when you're willing to pay for a much lower yielding across Queensland, WA, Tassie, 8 to 10% management fees on residential, right? It's very different to what we see in Victoria and New South Wales. But people like No Tomorrow pay 8 to even 11% in some states of resi management fees on gross rent, not net rent, and a lower yield. But then you're getting something that's between 5 and 7 net or higher or slightly lower, but it's net. And then you're wondering like, oh, I don't want to pay management on that. Everything seems good until it's not, or until it goes wrong. And that example you shared was definitely a big one.
Yep.
Loving the show and keen to invest? Well, book your free discovery call and we'll actually walk you through how to build a high growth portfolio without all the guesswork. Just jump onto the link in the show notes or visit investorkit.com.au to book your discovery call. And now let's get back into the show.
Another factor is the fact that if it's a fully net lease, as long as the leases have been written appropriately, the management fees are recoverable.
That's right.
Why would you not have somebody look after your property for you if you're not even going to have to pay for it?
Let's actually talk about leases while we're on to that, Allison. What small changes or big differences can, say if you're a do-it-yourself manager at the moment, what sort of big changes can you do if you have an up-and-coming renewal, to say like you have a gross lease at the moment, or, you want a market review done? What sort of changes can they do with that lease? And
well, if it's a renewal of lease, you can't change too much at that particular point in time. If it's an option to renew, typically you change the rent. It would be a market review upon renewal. You can sometimes make changes by negotiation, but typically it's just a market rent on renewal. But if the lease is coming to an end and you have an opportunity to renegotiate that lease, well, let's make sure that if they're a retail tenant, we explicitly state within the disclosure statement all of the outgoings that you'd like to recover, including management fees, including essential safety measures. Those are two things that became recoverable under the Retail Leases Act more recently, but you have to make sure that they are actually explicitly listed within the disclosure statement. Let's make sure that there is a disclosure statement if they are a retail tenant. That's something that, unfortunately I have come across, and that is a huge risk because the tenant could potentially get out of paying any outgoings or even get out of their lease. So let's make sure those things are in there. I would also be making sure any leases moving forward that we've put some kind of clause in to deal with CIPT later down the track. Particularly, if it's a 10-year lease, we want to be making sure that we've factored that in. If it's recoverable, that we've made it explicit within the lease.
So there's 3 big things I'm learning from there. Future-proofing your asset.
Oh, yeah.
The second part is keeping up with the times, meaning new laws, new taxes, and Victoria, no shying away from taxes, that's for sure.
Yeah, 100%.
And then the third part is risk management, not just future-proofing, because it sounds like missing the disclosures, missing things like that. All of a sudden, you could just pull out.
Yep.
Because it wasn't valid to begin with.
Yeah.
And so that's really, really tough when people face those issues and errors. So nailing those 3 definitely massive ways to just get value back, or at least structuring value in the deal.
Yeah.
You mentioned option terms before. The option terms, from an investor's perspective, from my buyer's perspective, they love option terms because they think, oh, great, it's a 3x3x3, awesome, 9 years. But actually, option terms favor the tenant.
They do.
Can we dive a little bit into that just as an educational piece for?
Yeah, absolutely. So an option term is the right of the tenant to renew the lease. That means that if the tenant wants to renew that 3-year term, the landlord must go ahead with it unless they are in arrears at the time when they try to exercise their option. So it's not really of benefit to the landlord. The tenant could, if they didn't have an option, still get to the end of their lease term, and then it's by negotiation between the two parties as to extending the lease or renewing the lease. Typically in an option term, there is a market review, which has a fairly rigid process. Something that I do as, you know, as a asset manager is actually try to get in early and discuss with the tenant what is going on. Are they happy? Do they want to stay? Let's talk about rent. You know, something that's happening in the Melbourne market right now is I would get onto the tenant quite early and say, look, I think if we talk to the landlord about exercising your option early, I'd probably be able to keep your rent the same for the first year of your new term, which is a fantastic result for my landlord, because if it had have gone to a market review, it probably wouldn't have gone in his favour.
That's strategic negotiation right
things
there.
like that, yeah. Or even, you know, applying a minimal increase, maybe the increase that they've had existing. So say if they were on a 3% increase or a 4% increase, basically going in and saying, well, how about we renew this early and then I can fix your increase to being what it already was.
So on the market rent range scale,
yeah,
you know, you could have probably ended up here if you were doing it yourself, or even below that market range scale, but actually you're going somewhere in the middle or on the higher end.
Yeah.
If you're factoring that increase.
Yeah. So that's a strategy, you know, that we incorporate into making sure that we are looking after our client, but also our tenant feels looked after as well, because they're feeling like hey, my property manager is looking after me. They're recognizing that I want to stay. They're working to help me make that happen even before I've thought of it. So that's something, you know, I guess when you have a manager in place, they're actually thinking about that. Whereas if it's not your core role, you know, you're going to your other job every day. You're not thinking about maybe issuing the required notices. I mean, there's fairly rigid requirements about issuing option notices to tenants. And if you miss them, again, there's lots of repercussions.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is a successful negotiation is a win-win.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of those dials that you can move from what you were doing in those examples. But also coming to your point, Chris, it's like, okay, the option unintentionally or almost always by the buyer or an owner, they think it's for them.
Yes.
All it is for them, in my opinion, is that if someone's committing to it, there is a potential intention for this to be seen long term. Right? Beyond that, though, it's all for the tenant.
That's right.
And that's cool. Like, it is what it is. But I mean, you know, this is where you don't want to get too much happy feet with the options. You don't want to be, you know, feeling like you've conquered that asset and it's going to be the perfect asset forever. I think what's more important is having the right person manage that asset. So when you get to those sticky periods, you've got firstly at the front end what you've talked about, whether it be the percentage-based increases or market review components. Or then when it gets to those sticky moments where it's coming close to it, that getting proactive rather than, oh, it's coming up to that time period, they just let us know. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that's a really important part. Allison, the last thing I want to touch on is you've talked about structure to get the best opportunity, strategy for the best, you know, tactful growth, or even some retention strategies. But I want to go deeper into retention, right? Because vacancy is not pretty in commercial. Yet there are mechanisms to protect it, and we'll jump into that in another session. But what are some things that you feel that property owners can deploy from a commercial perspective and that you regularly help people to reduce vacancies?
Sure. Well, I think where I was kind of coming at before was talking to tenants early and actually having a relationship with the tenant and understanding how their business is going, where they're sitting in terms of space. Do they need more space? Do they need less space? And understanding that early. If they've got any bugbears with the property, maybe, you know, there's a tenant next door that's making too much noise, things like that. You know, you need to understand these things.
Yeah.
So part of it is relationship. Also, obviously making sure that the property is maintained in a way that you don't have tenants complaining about it being too cold or too hot, because ultimately at the time when they want to renew, they think about their comfort. They think about how they're performing in that space. So that's a really important thing. And then also a big factor for us in the Melbourne market right now is tenants who are genuinely struggling, and how we can manage that to make sure that we don't get left with a tenant who's gone bust and left the property. We actually want to try and work with our tenants to keep them in the property at a rate that the landlord's still being looked after. Potentially it might be some form of relief, some form of renegotiation to basically, retain them in the property, because if they were to go, we would be left with quite a considerable amount of downtime.
Yeah. And, it's not only just like a strategy to have downtime avoided, but surely there's a feel-good element to that as well. When the business is going through a tough time, you as an asset manager specializing in structuring something right for them to win, the person holding the property to go, we got through this tough patch together.
Yep.
And the thing that people don't realize is like the consequences of a vacant location doesn't just impact the owner directly of that asset, but the appeal of that strip, the
100%.
building, the industrial site, whatever it may be, it reduces.
Yeah.
Because prospective buyers or tenancies elsewhere, you're missing a vibe, or you're missing confidence, or you're missing if a medical store GP, does it have a pharmacy? Is the pharmacy now vacant? Like, is the dentist next door now vacant? Like, these raise questions on so many levels.
Yep.
So I'm really glad that you talk about that, because if business owners can be less T's and C's, or property owners can be less T's and C's in certain moments, and certain dollars and ins and outs, and see the bigger picture, they'll actually have a much better outcome dollar-wise in the future, and absolute game changer. So
yeah, completely.
Yeah. Allison, thank you so much again for another episode. It's been absolute gold. I want people to know, whether in the Melbourne market or across different areas, how can people get in touch with you for support with asset management for their commercial properties? Or if they're looking to work with a greater team to exit, or other things that they need for the commercial property, how can people get in touch?
Well, certainly from a Melbourne office, you can look us up anywhere. But I would probably, given that we are in Sydney right now, I would just go to mmj.com.au, and we've got lots of prompts along there to assist you with whatever you would need. So jump on there, and we'll be able to help you.
Awesome. mmj.com.au, and thank you for tuning in to another Commercial Property Investing Insights podcast.